Sometimes the cruelest betrayals don't come from enemies on a distant battlefield, but from the very blood that shares your name. The Viking Age was a real-life Game of Thrones, where a crown was worth more than a brother and an inheritance was worth more than a son. What drives a man to raise his axe against his own family? Is it just raw ambition, a hunger for power? Or is it the belief that destiny has chosen your path and your path alone? When we think Viking, we usually picture external conflict, the raider, explorer, the warrior descending from the cold north to challenge the kingdoms of Europe. We imagine them united, a horde of horned helmets and bristling axes, a single force bound by blood, and a shared will to conquer. But this is a fantasy. The brutal truth is that the Viking Age was defined just as much by wars fought within its own halls as by those waged on foreign shores. The most dangerous enemy a Viking leader could have was often the man sitting beside him at the feast, his brother, his cousin, or even his own son. The Viking world, power was a fragile personal thing. It wasn't automatically inherited. It had to be won, and then it had to be held. A leader's authority rested on his skill in battle, his reputation for victory, and his generosity to his followers. It was a system built on a razor's edge of loyalty, where any sign of weakness could be an invitation for a rival to strike. And when those rivals shared your bloodline, the conflicts weren't just political, they were personal, vicious, and they tore families and kingdoms apart. These weren't simple squabbles. They were epic sagas of ambition, betrayal, and murder that shaped the destiny of nations. From the fractured legacy of a legendary hero to a father-son war that decided the fate of England, these are the true stories of Viking power struggles. Forget fiction. The historical record, immortalized in the sagas and chronicles, tells a far more dramatic story of Game of Thrones, where the stakes were absolute and family loyalty was a luxury few could afford. Few names from the Viking Age resonate like Ragnar Lothbrok. A figure blurring the line between history and legend, Ragnar was the archetypal Viking hero whose exploits in England and Francia became myth. But his most enduring legacy wasn't his own deeds, but the firestorm he unleashed through his sons, Bjorn Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, Fitzurk, and Sigurd Snake and Eye. Their story starts as one of incredible unity and ends as a cautionary tale of how even a common cause can shatter against the rocks of individual ambition. The catalyst for their bond was the ultimate provocation, their father's death. According to the sagas, after a reckless invasion of England with only 2 ships, Ragnar was captured by King Gla of Northumbria and executed by being thrown into a pit of vipers. When news reached his sons, the reaction was seismic, united by grief and a burning need for revenge. They assembled one of the largest Viking forces ever seen, the Great Heathen Army. This wasn't a raid for plunder. This was a war of annihilation, led by the strategic genius of Ivar the Boneless. The brothers landed in England in 865. They were a terrifying force, a perfect blend of their individual strengths. Ivar, who may have had a condition that gave him his boneless nickname, was the master tactician, a man whose mind was his greatest weapon. Bjorn Ironside was the classic Viking warrior, a fearless navigator and fighter who craved glory. Together, they were unstoppable. They marched on Northumbria, captured King Gla, and subjected him to the blood eagle, brutal, ritualistic execution that carved his back open like wings, a direct and horrific payment for the snake pit. With their vengeance complete, the Great Heathen Army didn't just pack up and go home. It had tasted victory and saw a fractured England that was ripe for the taking. For a while, the brothers' unity held. They conquered Northumbria, East Anglia, and stormed the great fortress of Nottingham. They acted as a single dynasty, claiming its inheritance not in land but in conquest. The sagas tell of how they divided their victories, ruling as joint kings over their new domains. This was the height of their power, the moment the Lothbrok legacy seemed set to forge a new Scandinavian empire on English soil. But empires built on vengeance have shaky foundations. Once the unifying enemy was gone, the cracks in the brotherhood began to show. The conflict came down to a fundamental disagreement on what to do next. Their once-aligned goals now diverged. Bjorn, the explorer, grew restless. He'd seen the Mediterranean and dreamed of more adventures, of pushing the boundaries of the known world. His ambition was external, focused on fame. Ivar the pragmatist saw the future differently. His ambition was internal, focused on consolidation and absolute control. He didn't just want to raid, he wanted to rule, to build a permanent kingdom in the British Isles with its heart in the strategic city of Dublin. These two philosophies simply couldn't coexist. You can't go exploring the world while also building a tightly controlled kingdom at home. The sagas captured this essential conflict, depicting a growing Tenshuna rivalry not of pure hatred but of opposing destinies. While there is no historical proof they went to war with each other as pop culture loves to show, the record does show them drifting apart. Their paths diverged until they were no longer allies, but competitors on the grand stage. Ivar solidified his power in Ireland, becoming a feared king in Dublin. Bjorn, after his adventures, returned to Scandinavia to rule as a wealthy king in Sweden. Hvitserk and Sigurd carved out their own territories elsewhere. The great heathen army, once a single weapon, had fractured. The brothers, once a united front, now ruled their own domains, their shared legacy dissolving into separate kingdoms. The tale of Ragnar's sons isn't a simple story of brother versus brother war. It's a more subtle and arguably more tragic story of divergence. Their initial unity was a historical fluke, a brief moment when personal ambition was eclipsed by a collective desire for revenge. But once that was done, the natural order of the Viking Age reasserted itself. Power was a zero-sum game, and even the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok couldn't share a single destiny. They didn't need to kill each other to become rivals, simply had to chase their own crowns. But the Sons of Ragnar weren't the only Viking family torn apart by ambition. Far from England's battlefields, on the wind-swept isolated islands to the north, another drama of betrayal was unfolding. This wasn't a conflict between four brothers with different destinies, but between two cousins with a shared one. We now move from the conquest of England to the claustrophobic politics of the Orkney Islands, where a dispute over an earldom would end in a brutal murder that created a saint. At the dawn of the 12th century, the earldom of Orkney was a powerful Viking state, a maritime crossroads ruled by Norse earls who commanded respect and fear. The earldom was supposed to be ruled jointly by two cousins, Magnus Erlendsson and Haakon Paulsson. Their fathers had ruled together as brothers, but the rivalry between their sons had already split the family. To prevent a lout war, a fragile truce was arranged. Magnus and Haakon would share power, just like their fathers had. From the very beginning, the two men were a study in contrasts. The asterisk, Orkneyinga, saga, asterisk, our main source for their story, paints a vivid picture. Haakon Paulsson was the classic Viking chieftain, ambitious, proud, and convinced he was the first among equals. He was a warrior, surrounded by loyal followers who thrived on conflict. Magnus Erlendsson, on the other hand, was described as pious, gentle, and quiet. During a Viking raid years earlier, he had famously refused to fight, staying on his ship to sing psalms, an act that set him worlds apart from his peers. For a time, the joint rule held. Between roughly 1105 and 1114, they managed a tense but peaceful coexistence. But their followers began to clash, and old family rivalries bubbled to the surface. Soon, the earldom was on the brink of civil war. The chieftains and farmers of Orkney, fearing total devastation, brokered a peace summit. The two URLs were to meet on the small island of Agilsay during Easter week of 1117, a holy time to finally settle their differences. The terms were clear, designed to prevent treachery. Each earl would bring only 2 ships and an agreed-upon number of men. Magnus honored the agreement. He arrived at Egilsay with 2 ships ready to negotiate in good faith. But as dawn broke, he saw a horrifying sight on the horizon. Haakon had not come with 2 ships, but with 8, all bristling with armed warriors. The betrayal was absolute. There would be no negotiation. Magnus knew he was trapped. He was captured and brought before Haakon, and the chieftains loyal to his cousin. According to the saga, Magnus, facing certain death, made 3 proposals to prevent more bloodshed. First, he offered to go on a pilgrimage and never return. Second, he offered to be exiled and imprisoned for life. Finally, he offered to be mutilated, blinded, or maimed, but be allowed to live. Haakon was reportedly willing to accept imprisonment, but his chieftains, tired of the dual earl system, shouted him down. They declared that one of the URLs had to die. They were done with shared rule. Seeing the resolve of his own men, Haakon's ambition crushed any lingering family sentiment. He declared that since he didn't want to die, Magnus must be the one slain. The grim task fell to Haakon's standard-bearer, who refused, horrified. In a final chilling act of cruelty, Haakon ordered his cook Leifulf to perform the execution. The saga records Magnus's final words, not cursing his cousin, but praying for the souls of his executioners. Ada said he asked only for a single clean blow to the head, as it wasn't proper to execute a chieftain like a common thief. Leifulf, weeping, struck the blow with an axe, and Earl Magnus was dead. Haakon Paulson was now the sole ruler of Orkney. He'd consolidated power and eliminated his rival. But the story of Magnus was just beginning. Almost immediately, miracles were reported at his murder site. The rocky ground where he fell was said to have turned into a lush, green field. After he was buried, reports of healings and other supernatural events began to spread. The cult of Magnus the Martyr grew so powerful, it couldn't be ignored. 1136, Magnus was officially canonized as a saint. His ambitious nephew later vowed to build a magnificent stone cathedral in his uncle's honor, the stunning St. Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall. A skeleton found within one of its pillars in 1919 bore a massive head wound. It's consistent with the axe blow described in the saga. Haakon achieved his earthly goal, but in doing so, he created a legacy for his cousin that would far outlast his own. From the windswept islands of Orkney, our story moves south to the Kingdom of Denmark. Here, the conflict wasn't between cousins, but between a father and a son. This wasn't a struggle for a remote earldom, but for one of the great thrones of the Viking world, a betrayal that would not only define a kingdom, but also set the stage for the conquest of England. In the late 10th century, King Harald Bluetooth was one of the most powerful and transformative rulers in Viking history. He was a unifier, a builder, and a modernizer. He finished the unification of Denmark, built massive ring forts to consolidate his power, and most momentously, converted to Christianity, bringing his kingdom into the fold of Christian Europe. A runestone he erected proudly proclaims his achievements. He won for himself all of Denmark and Norway, and made the Danes Christian. He was a king looking to build a stable, centralized monarchy. But not everyone shared this vision, least of all his own son, Sweyn. Sweyn, who would earn the nickname Forkbeard, was a product of the old world. He was a warrior, raised in a culture that valued raiding, personal glory, and taking wealth by force. The sagas paint a picture of a fiery relationship between father and son, a clash, not just of personalities, but of ideologies. The exact causes of Sweyn's rebellion are debated, but they likely stem from a potent mix of factors. Religion was a major issue. Harald's enforcement of Christianity was a radical shift from Norse tradition, and for many conservative chieftains, it was a betrayal of their gods. Sweyn became a rallying point for this pagan reaction, representing a return to the old ways. It was a classic conflict between a modernizing father and a reactionary son who saw his father's policies as weakness. But even more than religion, this was about power. Harald's centralized kingdom, with its taxes and defenses, clashed with the traditional model where a leader led raids and rewarded his warriors with plunder. Sweyn and his followers likely saw Harald's focus on building churches as neglecting the warrior spirit that had made the Vikings so feared. They wanted a king who would lead them to glory and riches abroad, not one building monuments at home. The tension finally exploded into open rebellion around the year 986. Sweyn, backed by disgruntled chieftains, declared war on his own father. This was patricide in motion. Son's forces met the father's in a decisive battle. According to the chronicler Adam of Bremen, King Harald, despite fighting bravely, was defeated and forced to flee. He escaped to Pomerania, wounded, and died shortly after. Sweyn Forkbeard had seized the throne through the deepest betrayal imaginable. His rule began on shaky ground. He was a usurper, and he struggled to consolidate his power. But Sweyn was a ruthless and formidable leader, quickly asserted his authority, and once Denmark was secure, he turned his attention outward, becoming the very warrior king his followers had wanted. His primary target was England. For years, Vikings had raided England, often being paid to leave with massive silver payments called danegeld. In 1002, England's king, the Thellard the Unready, ordered the St. Brice's Day massacre, a wholesale slaughter of Danish settlers, which supposedly included Sweyn's own sister. This brutal act gave Sweyn the perfect justification to move from raiding to outright conquest. For the next decade, Sweyn's invasions of England were relentless. He wasn't just raiding anymore. He was systematically breaking the will of the Anglo-Saxons. Finally, in 1013, he launched a full-scale invasion. Town after town submitted to his authority. London held out for a time, but eventually it too fell. King Tellard fled into exile, and on Christmas Day 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard was declared king of all England. He had achieved what no Viking leader before him ever had, starting with the betrayal of his own father. He had become the master of a vast North Sea empire. However, his triumph was incredibly brief. Just 5 weeks later, on February 3, 1014, Sweyn Forkbeard died suddenly. His empire fractured almost immediately. But the foundation he had laid was permanent. His son, Canute the Great, would return to England, reclaim his father's prize, and rule over a vast and prosperous Anglo-Scandinavian empire for nearly 2 decades. Sweyn's betrayal of his father was the first step on a path that led directly to a Viking on the throne of England, forever changing history. Patricide secured a kingdom, but what about fratricide? In Norway, the dream of a unified nation forged by one great king would be immediately threatened by his own children. The sons of the great unifier Harald Fairhair would show that a crown was thicker than blood, and that a nickname earned in battle against your own family could become a terrifying legacy. The unification of Norway in the late 9th century was the life's work of one man, Harald Fairhair. Through decades of brutal warfare, he forged a single kingdom from a patchwork of warring fiefdoms. But in creating his kingdom, he also created a dilemma. He had numerous sons, and in Viking tradition, each felt he had a claim to power. Harald's solution was to appoint his sons as regional client kings, but designate his favorite Eric as his heir and high king. It was a plan destined to fail. Eric, later given the grim nickname Bloodaxe, seemed to embody the most brutal aspects of the age. The sagas claim he earned it by systematically eliminating his own half-brothers. Seeing them as threats, he allegedly had several of them killed. This act of fratricide defined his character. He was a man who would stop at nothing to secure his power. When Harald Fairhair died around 932, Eric became the undisputed and widely feared High King of Norway. His rule was described as harsh and tyrannical. His powerful, manipulative wife Gunhild ruled through fear and alienated the Norwegian nobility. They had overlooked one crucial threat. Far away in England, at the court of King Aethelstan, was Eric's youngest half-brother, Haakon. He had been sent there to be fostered, a common political practice that also kept him safe from Eric's murderous ambition. Raised in the Christian English court, Haakon learned different methods of rule. While Eric was earning his bloody nickname in Norway, Haakon was being educated as a prince. He came to be known as Haakon the Good. The disgruntled Norwegian nobility, desperate to be rid of Eric Bloodaxe, saw their chance. They sent messages to England, inviting Haakon to return and claim his birthright. Backed by King Aethelstan, Haakon sailed for Norway around 934. His arrival ignited a civil war. Haakon was everything Eric was not. He was diplomatic and promised to restore the land rights his father had seized, a move that immediately won him widespread support. Eric Bloodaxe, the tyrant, suddenly found himself abandoned. Faced with a popular uprising led by his charismatic younger brother, he had no choice but to flee. Without a single major battle, Eric was forced into exile. Haakon the Good was now king of Norway. But Eric Bloodaxe wasn't a man to accept defeat. Exiled, he returned to the life of a Viking raider, eventually carving out a new kingdom for himself in Northumbria, in northern England. He became the King of York, but his reign there was as violent and turbulent as his time in Norway. His end finally came in 954, when he was betrayed and killed in an ambush. But Eric's death didn't end the conflict. It just passed to the next generation. His sons, spurred on by their vengeful mother Gunhild, saw their uncle Haakon as a usurper. With Danish support, they launched a series of invasions against Norway, determined to reclaim their father's throne. For the rest of his reign, Haakon was locked in a brutal war against his own nephews. The final confrontation came in 961, at the Battle of Fitjar. Haakon was once again victorious, driving off the last of his brother's sons. But at the moment of triumph, he was struck by an arrow. The wound was mortal. As he lay dying with no sons of his own, Haakon the Good made a final, pragmatic decision. He declared that, with no heir, the throne should pass to his enemies, the surviving sons of Eric Bloodaxe. He hoped this would finally bring peace to the kingdom. And so the line of Eric Bloodaxe, the fratricidal tyrant, returned to power in Norway.
Oh.
The lifelong struggle between the two brothers had come full circle. It proved that, in the world forged by Harald Fairhair, the bonds of brotherhood were the first casualties in the war for succession. A name like Bloodaxe wasn't just a colorful nickname. It was a statement of intent. The sagas of the Viking Age are filled with monsters, heroes, and epic voyages. But as we've seen, the most compelling dramas were often the ones that played out within the great halls and ruling families of Scandinavia. The stories of Ragnar's sons, Magnus and Haakon, Sweyn Forkbeard, and Eric Bloodaxe, are not isolated incidents. They are windows into the very soul of Viking politics. They reveal a world where power was personal and brutally contested. Loyalty was conditional, and betrayal was a common tool of the trade. In this real-life Game of Thrones, the person with the strongest claim was often simply the one most willing to seize it by any means necessary. From the shattered brotherhood of the Ragnarsons, we see that a common cause couldn't contain individual ambition. In the chilling murder of St. Magnus, we witness ambition so naked it drives a man to kill his own cousin. In Sweyn Forkbeard's rebellion, we see a son overthrow his father in a clash of old and new ideologies that culminates in the conquest of England. And in the lifelong war between Eric Bloodaxe and Haakon the Good, we see a kingdom torn apart by two brothers representing tyranny and diplomacy. These are the messy, complicated, and tragic realities behind the Viking ideal. They show us that the greatest threats to Viking power often came not from without, but from within. The bonds of family, the bedrock of society, could also be its most dangerous fault line. Because in the heart of a Viking warrior, the hunger for a legacy, for a kingdom, for a crown, was a fire that could consume everything, even a brother, a cousin, or a father. The true sagas are more than just dramatic. They're a timeless and brutal lesson in the eternal struggle for power. If you enjoyed this look into the dark heart of Viking politics, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and share it with others who want to discover the real stories behind the legends. Let us know in the comments which of these blood feuds you find the most shocking.